Hello and welcome to this Forth Valley and West Lothian supported study resource session. My name is Mr. Smith and I'm going to talk to you today about National 5 Modern Studies, the Enquiry Skills questions. The learning intention for today's session is to develop our knowledge and understanding of National 5 Enquiry Skills questions. These are as follows: conclusions, options, and support oppose. These are all worth 10 marks. The success criteria for today's session is to be able to analyse information from a range of sources, to be able to synthesise evidence from the sources, and to be able to evaluate the significance of numbers and statistics highlighted within the sources, and ultimately to be able to structure our own 10-mark responses to the range of questions. Throughout today's lesson, you will see various symbols on the slides which indicate what you should do. Take a minute to have a look at the symbols which may be used and what they mean. Today we will mainly be focusing on reading, writing and copying, correcting our work through self-reflection, and pausing the video at various stages to complete the tasks set. There are a range of resources which will be useful for today's session. You will need your jotter or paper, a pencil, and it's recommended that you have some highlighter pens and, if possible, a printed version of the skills questions which we're going to look at today. These can be found on the SQA website and they are highlighted on the screen. So what are Enquiry Skills questions in National 5 Modern Studies? Well, there are three types of skills question that you can be asked, and they will test a different skill each. So conclusions questions are testing your ability to read information and to draw conclusions which are backed up by evidence. Options questions are looking for you to pick out key pieces of information from a variety of sources to support a decision. And support oppose questions are looking for you to evaluate whether someone is being biased or selective when making a statement. There will be one of these questions in each section of your exam or assessment, and you will be required to complete one of each, meaning 3 in total. So what do you need to do? For every type of source-based question, you must only use the information from the sources to support your answer. This means that you do not need to put in any of your own knowledge in your answers that you've been learning about the topics you've been studying in class. So the answers you need are given in the sources. You must use all 3 of the sources at least once to achieve full marks. And you must state the evidence that you are using, as well as naming the source that you have taken the information from. We will begin today by looking in detail at how to answer conclusions questions. First, some background information. Conclusions questions are worth 10 marks. It can appear in any section of your assessment. The purpose of the questions is to make judgments on 4 sub-issues named in the question using the information provided. And you will get 3 sources of information, and like previously mentioned, you must use all 3 in your answer. How are conclusions questions marked? Well, as previously stated, 10 marks. You will gain 1 mark for each relevant and valid conclusion statement. And you can gain a further 2 marks for providing evidence from the sources to support each conclusion statement. So how will you answer these questions? Well, the first thing you must do is read the first statement that you must comment on and then write a conclusion, which is ultimately a summary for this. For example, you may use the words such as biggest, smallest, increasing, decreasing, no change, major impact, no influence, more or less, main group, and so on. You should then provide at least 1 piece of evidence to support this conclusion. You can gain another mark if you synthesize, in other words, support or back up this piece of evidence with another piece of evidence from a different source. And you should repeat this process for the other three conclusion topics. Key point here to remember is that you should never repeat evidence, using it only once. So, let's have a look at an example question from an SQA past paper. This is question 21 from the 2018 paper, and it reads as follows. Using sources 1, 2 and 3, what conclusions can be drawn about the influence of Indonesia? And you should reach a conclusion about each of the four following statements. The importance of the military to the Indonesian government, the importance of Indonesia's exports, Indonesia's influence within alliances, and the importance of tourism to Indonesia. And just to repeat previously mentioned, your conclusions must be supported by evidence from the sources, and you should link information within and between the sources in support of your conclusions. This is synthesis, and you must use all three sources. Taking a step back, when you open up your assessment, you may see the following question look like the following. As you can see, there are three sources of information, two of which have lots of text, and source 2 in this case, which is split across 2 pages and has a range of bar charts and graphs. Let's now look at the question in just a little more detail. You will see that there are 4 bullet points that you need to make a conclusion about. At this point, I recommend that you find yourself 4 different coloured highlighter pens and that you highlight the 4 bullet points each a different colour. I then recommend what you do is take the first bullet point and carefully work your way through the 3 sources of information, spending 2 or 3 minutes reading each and looking to highlight any evidence which you can find which might help us draw a conclusion about the first bullet point. You should then repeat this task using a different colour for the second and the third and the fourth bullet points, repeating the process of reading and analysing the 3 sources, highlighting any information you can possibly find that links and may help you make a conclusion. I therefore recommend that you pause just now. You may also now pause and do the same for source 2 and repeat the process for source 3. If you have a printed copy of the question, then you can highlight as you're going. If not, you may need to pause this video clip at the different sources and read through the information in detail. So now that we've had some time to read and highlight information to help us perhaps make a conclusion about the first bullet point, let's practice the process in writing a 3-mark response. To begin, what you should do is write down the first bullet point, so the importance of the military to the Indonesian government. You may then look to use a structure similar to the one now appearing on the screen. One conclusion is that the military are not seen as important to the Indonesian government. Now that conclusion would get you 1 mark. What we now need to do, because we've said that it's not important, that is our conclusion, we need to prove and back that up with 2 pieces of evidence. We can go into source 1 and we can highlight some information which helps us back up that conclusion. And we can structure it as follows. This will get us our 2nd mark. And then we can go back into another source to find further evidence which backs up our conclusion. Note here that a common pitfall that some pupils fall foul to is not noticing that actually source 2 is split across 2 different pages. And when they write their answer, they will actually use source 2 continued as source 3, which might mean that they will lose the mark. So that's something just to be wary of. And we can add that information into our overall first conclusion, which reads like this. So One conclusion is that the military are not seen as important to the Indonesian government, 1 mark. This is supported by source 1, which shows that Indonesia is ranked 116th in the world for military spending. That's your 2nd mark. And then back it up. Furthermore, source 2 states that South Sudan spends far more of its GDP on the military, 10.3%, compared to only 0.9% of Indonesia's GDP, which will get you your first 3 marks. Notice here the sentence starters that I have used to be able to structure my first conclusion, using words like one conclusion is, and then this is supported by, and then furthermore, always naming the sources where you've taken your information. It is important for practice that you note down that first model conclusion so that you can refer back to it when you're carrying on with your own practice. We're going to very briefly have a little look at how to finish off answering this question by looking at the 2nd, 3rd and 4th bullet points. The second one is the importance of Indonesia's exports. And we can say that one conclusion is that Indonesia has some very important exports. And we can go into 2 sources to find information which will back that up. And that will allow us to make our overall 3-mark second conclusion. Conclusion 3, Indonesia's influence within alliances. We can say that one conclusion is that Indonesia is very influential within alliances. And we can delve back into 2 different sources, in this case source 1, looking at the fact that Indonesia is a member of several alliances. And then we can look for information in another source, in this case source 3, which also talks about Indonesia's place within several international alliances. That will allow us to complete our overall 3rd conclusion. Again, note the sentence starters being very consistent. One conclusion is, this is supported by, this is backed up, or furthermore, these types of words. Our final conclusion for this question to achieve the overall 10 marks is to make a conclusion about the importance of tourism to Indonesia. Finally, one conclusion is that tourism is very important to Indonesia. And then we can go into different sources to find evidence. Note once again that source 2 is split across 2 pages in this example. And then we can add that information into our answer. For example, source 2 shows us that tourism brings in almost $10 billion to the Indonesian economy. And then we can go into source 3. And we're looking for information which talks about tourism. This allows us to make our overall 3-mark conclusion. One conclusion is that tourism is very important to Indonesia. Source 2 shows us that tourism brings in almost $10 billion to the economy. And this links to source 3, which states that the government has also set up a department to promote tourism, which is significant as it must view it as important. Here is an overall summary answer. I would like you to make sure that you have at least copied this full example for 10 marks, and then to use this example of an overall summary to self-reflect on your understanding and knowledge of these questions. Doing this will allow you to gauge how effectively you've been able yourself to select and synthesize information if you completed the task mentioned a few minutes back. Were you able to highlight the relevant information to help you draw conclusions about the 4 different bullet points? And furthermore, when you go on to practice more of these questions, reflecting on the structure of this answer will allow you to self-check against your own. For that reason, I have attached a self-assessment checklist. And every time you answer a conclusions question, I recommend you answer or ask yourself the following questions. Have you made a conclusion about all 4 sub-issues? Have you provided 2 pieces of evidence for each conclusion? Have you used evaluative terminology to summarise trends? Words such as largest, greatest, majority, significant? And have you used all 3 sources? Just to repeat, every time you have a go at a conclusions question, use this self-assessment checklist to tick off whether or not you have met all the criteria. We're now going to very briefly talk about another conclusions question, this time the 2019 SQA past paper question 7. And you can see once again you need to make conclusions about 4 bullet points. Taking a step back again to have a look at what this question might look like in an assessment, you can see clearly that there are 3 sources that you need to make 4 conclusions about. Source 1 is a text box with lots of information about trade unions. Source 2 is not split across 2 pages in this case and is a graph and bar chart. And source 3 is a table with what looks like a map identifying trade union membership as a proportion of employees across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Remember, we want to put down the first bullet point before we construct our answer, and we want to make a conclusion, a valid conclusion. One conclusion is that UK trade union membership has decreased, and we should go into the sources to find information to back up that conclusion. Note that we are able to conclude from the graph in source 2 that trade union membership has decreased from 2008 to 2018, and that we are able to back that up with the facts detailed in source 1, which also discusses trade union membership. Therefore, your possible conclusion may look as follows. One conclusion is that trade union membership has decreased. Source 2 shows that in 2008, membership was just over 7 million, but by 2018 it had fallen to just over 6 million. And that this is supported by source 1, which states that trade union membership was once as high as 13.2 million, meaning that membership has more than halved in total since the late 1970s. So, now that we've completed one full 10-mark conclusions question, and we've had a look at one conclusion for our second question, it's your turn. I would like you to use the QR code or link below to the SQA website to complete question 7 from the 2019 paper. If you wish, you may then hand it to your teacher for feedback. At this point, before we move on to look at our second skill in National 5, you may wish to pause this and complete that task. Now that you've done so, we're going to have a look at how to answer options questions, our second National 5 skill. First, some background information. Options questions are again worth 10 marks. You will get an options question in one section of your exam or assessment. And the purpose of these questions is to choose between 2 options, giving reasons and evidence for doing so. And once more, you will get 3 sources of information in which you must use all 3. Marking instructions for options questions. A reminder, 10 marks. You must give evidence for your chosen option and against the option that you've rejected. And if you don't give evidence against the rejected option, you can only achieve a maximum of 8 out of 10. You will also lose marks if you do not use all sources at least once. And remember, just like conclusions, to always name the source where you found your information. So how do we answer options questions? Well, to begin, you should write the heading, recommendation, and then clearly state which option you're choosing, either option 1 or option 2. You should then write the heading, arguments for option, and again, either 1 or 2, and then give a direct quote or evidence from one source, and then back it up, support it with evidence from another source, looking to synthesize information where possible. Now we need to repeat that either 3 or 4 times. Finally, you should then write the heading, arguments against the other option, and then once more give a quote to support the rejected option, and then disprove this with evidence from another source. And you should do this between 1 and 2 times. I would always recommend that you choose to do arguments for the option you've chosen 4 times, and then arguments against the other option just once, to maximise your chance of getting the full marks if you were to make a mistake. Because a common pitfall for most pupils is that they struggle to understand how to properly construct their arguments against the other options section. Overall, it is important that you think about getting 1 mark for each piece of evidence that you use. So in that case, you're looking to have 5 short paragraphs in total. So let's now turn our attention to an example question from the 2015 SQA past paper. This is question 3, and it says, you must decide which option to recommend, either Daisy Frost, which is option 1, or Tom Kirk, which is option 2. And you will see you must use all 3 sources to identify which option you would choose. You must give reasons to support your choice, and explain why you did not choose the other option. Remember to use all 3 sources for the full 10 marks. Now, your task. Look at the question and, like previously, take between 2 and 3 minutes to read through each source of information. And for example purposes, we're going to focus on choosing option 1, Daisy Frost for MSP. Here is what source 1 looks like. And once again, I would recommend that you use 2 different coloured highlighters this time, and you highlight any evidence which supports option 1 in one colour, and highlight any information that might support option 2, Tom Kirk, in another colour. I would recommend repeating this in all 3 sources of information. You may now pause this clip to go and complete that task. For source 1, highlight evidence for both option 1 and option 2 in source 2, and the table, which is source 3. Let's have a look now at how we will structure our answer. To begin, we want to, remember, state the option that we have chosen. It might look like this. I recommend option 1, Daisy Frost as MSP. And then we need to find some information from the source which helps us back up our choice. So I would choose Daisy as she has experience as a counsellor. And then we may structure our answer as follows. One reason to recommend option 1 is that source 1 says that Daisy has experience as a local counsellor. We then need to delve into another source to find any information, a little bit like what we did in conclusions questions, which backs up, or in other words, synthesises our first piece of information. We then add that to our answer. And then you want to go and repeat this process, remember, between 3 and 4 times. I would recommend that you write or copy this example down for revision purposes. We now want to have a little look briefly at what we will do in terms of rejecting the other option. We want to find some information which gives us a reason for why we could choose option 2, Tom Kirk. And we want to structure the final part of our answer like this. People who support option 2 argue that childcare isn't a problem for the people in Glenlockie, shown in source 1, 1 mark. And we then want to disprove this by finding information which proves that it is not true. And we can find that from the opinion poll in source 2. That allows us to structure our answer like so. However, source 2 shows us that 68%, or in other words 2/3 roughly, of people agree or strongly agree that it is a problem, suggesting that option 1 will address the issue better. And you want to repeat this process for arguments against the other option between 1 and 2 times. Note the different sentence starters and how we structure the arguments against the other option, and how this process is ever so slightly more challenging than finding arguments which support the option that you have chosen. And here you will find an overall summary of a 10-mark response. Note that there are 3 paragraphs here which recommend option 1, and there are 2 example paragraphs which are against option 2. You may wish to use this example answer to self-reflect on your own work. Were you able to identify relevant information to support option 1 within the sources, and also to reject option 2 within the sources? Self-reflecting will help you when you're practicing further questions down the line. Again, I have created a self-assessment checklist, ultimately questions to get you to think about whether or not you have completed options questions in the correct structure. Ask yourself, have you clearly stated which option you have chosen? Have you written between 3 and 4 paragraphs giving evidence to support your option, whether it's option 1 or option 2? Have you synthesized evidence? Remember, synthesis is combining 2 pieces of evidence which link together well. And have you written between 1 and 2 paragraphs giving evidence which rejects the other option? And a little bit like conclusions questions previously looked at, have you used all 3 sources? Use that checklist as you are completing options questions throughout your studies of National 5 Modern Studies. It's now time to turn our attention to, like we did with conclusions questions, a second example options question, and in this case we're looking at a 2016 past paper from the SQA, and it's question 9. And you must decide which option to recommend, either to introduce a fizz tax on sugary drinks, which is option 1, or to not introduce a fizz tax on sugary drinks, option 2. Remember, you need to use all 3 sources, you need to give evidence to support your choice, and you need to give evidence explaining why you did not choose the other option. Use all 3 sources for 10 marks. Again, here's a little look at what the question looks like when we take a step back. And for example purposes, again, we would choose option 1. Remember, always start by writing or stating which option you've chosen. So remember, in this case, we're looking to choose option 1 to introduce a fizz tax. We then want to go into the source to try to find 2 pieces of information which will help us. So we have stated that we have chosen option 1. We have then used the similar structure to our first question. One reason I would recommend option 1 is because source 1 states that a 20% fizz tax per litre would raise £1 billion per year for the NHS. We then back that up with a second piece of evidence from another source. This is supported by source 3, which states that any money raised from a fizz tax could be used to tackle many health-related issues such as dental decay, diabetes and obesity. This shows that introducing a fizz tax would have a significant and positive effect on the health of the people in the UK. Remember to repeat this process between 3 or 4 times in total. To give further information to support our second example, we want to continue to find information which rejects the other option, and we may structure it as follows. I recommend option 1. You've then given 3 to 4 paragraphs supporting option 1, and you will finally give between 1 and 2 reasons why you rejected option 2. So for example, source 1 states that the BMJ believes a fizz tax would reduce the number of overweight people by 285,000. However, source 3 shows that obesity rates actually increased by 3% in the USA since the introduction of a fizz tax, showing little supporting evidence for the positive effects. We'll repeat that between once or twice, and just note that we may want to use the word however in any paragraph that we write rejecting the other option. Now that you have one paragraph supporting option 1 and one paragraph rejecting option 2, your next steps are to use the QR code and link below to the SQA website to complete question 9 from the 2016 paper. Note that you may wish to finish the question supporting option 1, but you could also have a go at completing the question choosing option 2, reversing the way that you answer the question. At this point, you may wish to pause the clip to have a go at completing that question while it's still fresh in your memory. And if you wish, you may hand it to your teacher for feedback. And the final part of today's session is to have a look at the third and final skills-based question in National 5 Modern Studies. We call those the support and oppose questions. Some background information about support and oppose questions. Well, like conclusions and options, they are worth 10 marks. The purpose of these questions is to identify evidence for and against a particular statement. And like the previous 2 questions, you will also have 3 sources of information and must use all 3. The marking instructions then suggest that, again, 10 marks, that you will get 1 mark for each piece of relevant evidence that you give, and that you can gain extra marks for synthesis, again combining evidence, linking your second piece of evidence to the first piece of evidence. So how do we answer support oppose questions? Well, we begin by writing there is evidence to support and then give the name of the person making the statement when he or she says, and then insert the quote within the statement. This will be more obvious when we go on to look at an example question in about a minute's time. You should then give up to 5 pieces of evidence to prove this, so try to include synthesis where possible, supporting evidence from one source with a fact from another, and then to get your final 5 marks in the question, you want to repeat this process, but for opposing evidence. So you should then write there is evidence to oppose the name of the person giving the statement when he or she says insert quote, and you should then give up to 5 pieces of evidence to try to prove this, and again including synthesis as far as possible. And it's important to remember that we should not reuse evidence more than once. So now let's have a look at an example question from the SQA 2019 past paper, question 14. It says, using sources 1, 2 and 3, give reasons to support and oppose the view of Ivy Jackson. The statement that Ivy Jackson has made is, enough support is being provided to reduce reoffending. It's important to note here that you must give evidence that supports the view of Ivy Jackson and evidence that opposes the view of Ivy Jackson. We're looking to find 5 for each from across the three sources. So taking a step back, we want to have a little look at how the question is structured. Source 1 is an extract from a newspaper article. Source 2 provides more information about the types of support available to reoffenders, including a table. And source 3 is 2 prisoner profiles. Note that this type of source, source 3, is common and that usually one person's views will have more information to support the view outlined in the question, in this case the view of Ivy Jackson, and the other profile is likely to have more information which will help you oppose Ivy Jackson's view. So we know the question, we know the statement, and we know the view of Ivy Jackson. Once more, I recommend that you take yourself a couple of highlighters and that you highlight any information that you see across the three sources that supports the view of Ivy Jackson in one colour and any information that opposes Ivy Jackson in another colour. I would recommend that at this point you take between 2 to 3 minutes to read through each source and try to find evidence which supports and then opposes the view of Ivy Jackson. You may wish to pause this video at this point and have a look through source 1 to begin with. And then repeat this process for source 2. And finally, pause on source 3 and repeat this process. Once again, it's worth highlighting that if you have a physical printed paper copy of this question, your life will be made ever so slightly easier. So how do we structure our answer to a support-oppose question? Well, we want to begin by writing the comment, "There is evidence to support Ivy Jackson" when she says enough support is being provided to reduce reoffending. And we want to delve into the sources to find information which supports this. Remember, we're looking for 5 and we're looking to synthesize information where possible. We then structure our support section as follows. And very simply, we have 2 sentences with 2 pieces of information picked from 2 different sources which backs and supports the view of Ivy Jackson. You may also get extra marks for evaluation, something that reads a little bit as follows. This shows that the majority of offenders who access available support are less likely to reoffend. We then want to go back into the sources to find information to help us support the view of Ivy Jackson. In this case, we're looking at source 2. And we want to synthesize that information with evidence from another source. In this case, we will go into source 3, and we will take information from one of the prisoner profiles. As you will see here, very simply, if we take out the evaluation, all we're doing really is listing different reasons to support Ivy Jackson, and if we can achieve 5 of them, then that will be 5 marks. We then want to find a final piece of evidence to support Ivy Jackson. In this case, we can go into source 1. And without the need to synthesize, because we have our 5th one, we can leave that like so. We then want to go in to find evidence which opposes the view of Ivy Jackson. So we may write, "There is evidence to oppose Ivy Jackson" when she says enough support is being provided to reduce reoffending. And then we'll go into source 1 to try to find information. And like we did for the support section of our answer, we will structure it very similarly. This will get us our 6th mark. And synthesizing it will allow us to achieve our 7th mark. Repeating that process once more will allow us to get our 8th mark and our 9th mark too. To be able to get our 10th mark, remember, we need to find another piece of evidence without the need to synthesize it. From this case, it will be again from source 1. And this is how we may structure our 10th mark. It is very easy to get your 10 marks by quite simply listing 5 reasons to support the view of Ivy Jackson and then 5 reasons to oppose the view of Ivy Jackson. Now we can have a look at the overall answer summary. Once again, you might want to use this to self-reflect on your own work. When you highlighted information during the task a few minutes back, did you identify the similar information to what is outlined in this overall summary answer? Again, you may want to copy down this complete model answer so that you can refer to it when you're doing your own practice support oppose questions. Remember, self-reflection is a great skill for self-improvement. And finally, here is a self-assessment checklist for support oppose questions. Ask yourself when you complete any support oppose question, have you identified 5 pieces of evidence to support the view? Have you identified 5 pieces of evidence to oppose the view, for and against? Have you managed to synthesize evidence as far as possible? And have you used evaluative terminology where possible too? A reminder to ask yourself whether you have used all 3 sources at least once throughout the question. Now we can turn our attentions to another example. In this case, it is the SQA 2018 past paper question 7. And again, we will see a person's view, in this case Archie Murray. There is widespread support for replacing the current system used to elect MPs with a form of proportional representation in the House of Commons. Again, this is a gentle reminder that the topic of the question may be from any area of a modern studies course. So just because you studied support oppose questions during your World Powers unit does not mean that the support oppose question that you may be asked in an assessment will be from that unit also. Likewise, if you have studied democracy in Scotland, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a question, a skills question, from the democracy in Scotland unit. Having a look at this example, it is from the democracy in the UK section, looking at the House of Commons. However, it is expected that you can use information from across different modern studies topics and apply the skills, and that's the key message here. So taking a step back and having a look at this example question, source 1 is text about electoral reform, source 2 appears to be a website screenshot and table, and source 3 is a newspaper extract and opinion platform. So let's have a look at a quick example. There is evidence to support the view of Archie Murray when he says there is widespread support for replacing the current system to elect MPs in the House of Commons. Remember, that's finding evidence for. We then want to go into the sources and highlight information which allows us to find evidence to support the view of Archie Murray. In this case, evidence from source 3 and evidence from source 1. And we may structure our response as follows. There is evidence to support the view of Archie Murray when he says there is widespread support for replacing the current system used to elect MPs in the House of Commons. And we've put the information from source 1 and source 3 into a short paragraph. Remember, we can use evaluation to help us achieve a 3rd mark. And for example purposes, we want to have a look at finding evidence which opposes the view of Archie Murray. Again, we can take this from source 2 and from source 3. And we can put that into our example here to finish it off, like so. It might be worthwhile copying this example down. And now it's time to have a little think about our next steps before we finish up. And like the last two questions, I recommend that you use the QR code and the link below to the SQA website to complete question 7 from the 2018 paper. You may pause this video at this point to go and find that and do that. And if you so wish, you can go and hand it back to your teacher for feedback. Overall, to review this recorded supported study lesson, we need to self-assess our progress against today's success criteria. I would like you to rate your learning today out of 5 against each of the success criteria. 5 being clear and confident, with 1 being unsure and requiring more support. Please use this self-assessment to get the appropriate support from your class teacher. Finally then, let's look at your next steps overall for Enquiry Skills questions. You may wish to visit the SQA website at any time to attempt a range of past paper questions. Both Enquiry Skills and Knowledge and Understanding can be found there. And you should look to practice these in timed conditions to help refine the skill. The general rule is between 1.5 and 2 minutes per mark. Therefore, you should aim to complete a 10-mark inquiry-based skills question in approximately between 15 and 20 minutes. And finally, I would just like to thank you for taking your time to watch this supported study resource video, and good luck with your upcoming assessments.